Welcome to Gamer Thoughts. Today we're talking about porting games. So recently I've seen a lot of chatter about console exclusivity and porting games, which is not a new conversation, but one that gets reinvigorated every time there's a major release. Specifically, the one that brought this to my attention and made me want to dig deeper into it was Final Fantasy XVI, and it being a PlayStation 5 exclusive. And I wanted to take some time to look through the data, figure out what's going on, and talk about why this happened. Now, before I get into this video, two big disclaimers. Disclaimer number one, yes, I own a PS5, but I am not an exclusivity fanboy. I don't think exclusivity is good, and I think it hurts all gamers to not be able to play everything on whatever platform they choose. And two, I do not have access to secret information that you don't have. Most of my sources are secondary. They're interviews, they're press releases, things that can be found online. I did not get the chance to interview someone personally and get some secret mind-blowing realization that can't already be found. However, in my day job, I do a lot of analytics, I do a lot of forecasting, I do planning to help companies make decisions, and I was able to pour through this data and kind of see why Square Enix would decide to go for a platform exclusive with Final Fantasy XVI, and kind of generally why someone would. So I wanted to go through that data, and I wanted to give you an idea of why it happens. So the short answer is it's economics, but you're not here for the short answer, you're here for the nitty-gritty. So let's get into it. So there's three major things that I want to talk about when it comes to why a company would choose exclusivity or choose to port something. And it comes down to kind of three things, and that's the cost of it, optimization time and release windows, and benefits to exclusivity. And I want to use some previous game examples to illustrate those points. So first, I want to talk about dev costs and profits and what it actually takes to make a AAA title. So I have two examples from the last couple of years that we can kind of look at to get an idea of what it costs. So the first example I want to give is God of War Ragnarok. God of War Ragnarok was released in 2022, and due to some interviews, we know that it took about 4 years of dev time and it cost about $200 million to make. So simple math, 200 divided by 4, that's about $50 million a year to produce God of War Ragnarok. A similar game in terms of AAA quality and dev time and cost was Elden Ring. Elden Ring, thanks to some interviews we knew, took about 5 years of dev time and also cost about $200 million to make. So we know that to make a game, a big AAA studio game, you're looking at about $40 to $50 million per year in cost. Now that number is going to be important, and we're going to make a fair few assumptions based on that number. So looking at the standard price of a game, $60, doing the math, you would think, oh, so if they sold 4 million copies, they're going to be profitable. That's $240 million. However, that's not necessarily the case. Whatever platform the company chooses to sell on takes a commission. This commission is pretty standard across the board. It's about 30%. Steam is 30%, Xbox is 30%, Sony is 30%, and there's other costs associated with it too. They don't just take home an instant 70% of whatever they sell. But for simplicity's sake in this argument, let's say it's a third. If a game's $60, a company gets 40 million for every 1 million sales they do. That takes it from needing to sell 4 million to be profitable to needing to sell 5 million just to cover costs. That's before you are in the profitability range. And so those numbers are huge. And pretty much the only platform that doesn't take a 30% cut that I was able to find was Epic, which we have seen a lot of companies, including Square Enix, release a port exclusively to the Epic store, and it's due to that commission. That commission is a huge deal. Another thing to remember is that through the lifetime of a game, just because a game hits maybe 10 million copies sold, not every single one of those copies was sold at full price. Sales happen. Ports can be cheaper than their original counterparts, and we're going to look at a game where that was the case. So knowing that it's about $40 to $50 million a year and about $1 million in sales to basically justify that year of production costs, we can look at kind of optimization time and is it worth it to port a game? So a couple games that I want to look at, and we're going to stick with Square Enix titles, are Final Fantasy XV and the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters, because these are games that got ports at a later date that kind of give us an idea of how long it takes to port a game. Looking at the Pixel remasters, those games were released separately, but the final one was released February 2022. That was the last Pixel remaster game that got released of the group of 6. That collection would later go on to be ported to Switch and PlayStation 4, and there was a big uproar about why it wasn't coming to Xbox at the time. These released April 2023, more than a year after the PC releases. And these are pixel games. These are older titles. These are retro titles. And it still took, if we assume that they started porting them immediately after FF6 was released, it took over a year to get these games on console, which is notoriously easier to port for because it's one piece of hardware and optimization is less steps. Another Square title was FF15 that went the opposite direction. FF15 was initially released on Xbox and PlayStation 4, and then that was November 2016. It was released on PC March of 2018 with a Windows edition. So that's almost a year and a half for a much more complicated game to go to PC. So if we were to take both these examples, those are over a year. If we say they didn't necessarily start working on it immediately after finishing, maybe they weren't sure if they were going to do it. All in all, we can say that porting takes at least a year. If it's not done from conception, if it's after a release and they decide, hey, we're going to turn around and port this to a different platform, we can assume about a year of development time, which makes us say probably about $40 to $50 million to create that port. That's probably the equation that they're looking at. They're saying, hey, are we going to get enough sales to justify the extended development time of this title? Another thing to note is that post the release, dev time doesn't necessarily stop. So if they spend a year, they may spend 6 months further optimizing. We have seen over the last couple of years several games that had huge optimization issues when released to PC. It is difficult to release a game on PC because there are so many configurations. And I can pull up meme after meme after meme on Twitter of people who just have no faith in PC releases anymore because of bad optimization. Are there games that do it right? Absolutely. But it seems with these big AAA titles that it is becoming more and more difficult to optimize to PC, and that increases the amount of time spent on the game even after release. So with that in mind, we're looking at, it's about, you need 1 million sales to justify the year of additional dev time to port something over. That's the assumption we are going to look at, is that it's about $40 to $50 million it takes a year, and you need to sell 1 million copies at kind of that standard game price to cover that. So with that information in mind, I want to look at what's probably going through Square Enix's head in terms of actual sales numbers to see if porting the game to other platforms is worth it. And the example we're going to do for that is Final Fantasy XV, the most recent mainline Final Fantasy in memory. So we do have some numbers that we can look at to determine how Final Fantasy XV did on multiple platforms. So Square Enix itself released a report that Final Fantasy XV sold 5 million copies on day one. This was in November of 2016. A few other numbers that we need to look at is install base, because when FF15 first went on sale, it went to PlayStation and Xbox. At the time, Sony released a sales record stating that they had sold 50 million PS4s by December 2016. We don't have specific numbers for Xbox, but recently Xbox, in talking about their competition with Sony, said that Sony sold 2-1 on Xbox. So if we carry that number back to 2016, we can assume 25 million Xbox consoles were out at the time. The next piece of information that we have on FF15 sales came from European physical sales charts, because those are often used to kind of track how games are doing. When those day one sales happened, FF15 sold 4-1 on PlayStation versus Xbox. So if there were 5 million day one sales, we can say there were 4 million on Sony and 1 million on Microsoft. Now, that right there is a huge indication of, there's obviously a larger fan base for Final Fantasy on Sony. However, I don't want to stop the story there and just talk about Xbox. I also want to talk about PC, and I want to talk about current estimated console predictions. So if we look at those day one sales, that's 5 million. We found out in 2022 that Final Fantasy XV sold 10 million total copies. They did a celebration tweet about it. Now, not every single one of those copies was sold at full price like day one, and even the PC port, which did come a year and a half later, was priced at $50 upon release rather than the initial $60 for the game. As to how many of those copies sold on PC, according to Steam Spy, there's about 1 to 2 million sales on Steam. Now, Steam isn't the only way to purchase Final Fantasy XV for Windows, but it is often considered one of the largest storefronts for purchasing games on PC. And so we can assume probably around 2 million sales for the total for PC sales of Final Fantasy XV. So if we break that down, if we have 10 million sales, we know that 2 million of them are PC, or we're assuming that 2 million of them are PC, and then that leaves 8 million to split between Xbox and PlayStation. Looking at that split, if we continue the 4-to-1 ratio, these are the numbers we get. It's about 1.6 million sales on Xbox and 6.4 million sales on PlayStation. So between all three, PlayStation is a clear front runner for Square Enix. And Square Enix has known this for many years. Square Enix has had a very long-running relationship with PlayStation. So it makes sense that they would cater to their largest chunk of their fan base to start. How big is that fan base, though? As of January 2023, Sony has announced that they've sold 30 million PS5s. A much smaller install base than when Final Fantasy XVI came out. They were 50 million PS4s, and now there are 30 million PS5s. If we look at the math, with 4 million sales on an install base of 50 million, that's 1 in 12.5 PlayStation players bought Final Fantasy XV. So that's taken into account, and Final Fantasy XV wasn't necessarily pushed as the game of this is why you want to own a PlayStation, where Final Fantasy XVI is kind of being marketed as a huge seller for PS5. I'm suspecting that Square Enix is hoping to catch better than 1 in 12.5, probably 1 in 10. I'm assuming that Square Enix is probably trying to sell 3 million copies of Final Fantasy XVI day one. Now, based on our previous math, if we're saying $40 million is going back to Square Enix for every 1 million sales, that's saying they're hoping to make $120 million on Final Fantasy XVI on launch day, which seems like operating at a loss if we're assuming that these big games are taking about $200 million to develop. This brings us to one of our final points of why console exclusivity would happen, and that's kind of the benefits that Sony is getting from console exclusivity. So first off, one thing is it's becoming more normalized for Sony games to cost $70. So our math for sales on $60 becomes a little different because we're looking at it at 70. But also with bigger studios for exclusivity, PlayStation, Microsoft, other groups are known to give benefits to these larger publishers that they know are going to sell million copies. Whether that's a direct cash incentive, whether that's help with optimization of the game, or whether that's a cut to the commission that they're going to take on the sale, there is some kind of incentive to be exclusive. If that incentive is a cut on the commission that makes it so Square Enix can make $50 instead of $40 on every sale, that goes from 120 million to 150 million they're making off day one sales. If it's optimization assistance, that could help Square Enix to turn around and say, oh, we're going to be able to release this game sooner than planned, which allows them to avoid release windows. Say it helped them to release 6 months sooner, it avoids a release window with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And say they release a year earlier, it avoids a release window with the next expansion of Final Fantasy XIV, which Creative Business Unit 3 is also over and is widely considered Square Enix's cash cow right now based on the last year of financial reports from Square Enix. So while it looks like porting Final Fantasy XVI to PC could be profitable, it stands to generate at least 2 million sales, which would cover the cost of 1 year of dev time and then some. The benefits that Final Fantasy could be getting from Sony for that initial year or however long of exclusivity is going to help them immensely to achieve profitability with those smaller install bases. They would lose those exclusivity benefits if they were going to PlayStation 5 and PC. So hopefully, looking at all of this, we kind of get the idea of the amount of time it takes to port something, the cost it takes to port something, and the sales that are involved to justify it. Do I think Final Fantasy XVI should come to PC? Yes, absolutely. Do I understand why Square Enix is choosing to go with console exclusivity first? Yes, I do. It seems to make the most economic sense to recoup the cost of making this game and become profitable. But those are my thoughts. Those are the numbers. Hopefully this answered the burning question for you of, hey, why isn't Final Fantasy XVI coming to PC? I do know that it's not perfectly accurate numbers, and I do know that there was a lot of estimation, but hopefully this gave you an idea of what a strategy analyst at one of these companies would look at when they turn around and say, hey, should we port this game over? Should we go exclusive? What kind of conversations were had? If you like this content, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And as always, much love. We'll see you next time.